Well, yes, been having a bit of a look at this, Kieran. So this issue of state borders, how sustainable it is that states like Queensland and Western Australia in particular are prepared to shut borders after just a handful of cases in what's becoming a stop-start process aimed at elimination of the virus. Even today we had Northern Territory who had said all of South Australia is barred. Everyone from there were just declaring Adelaide the hotspot, so they changed their position within a day. New South Wales today not shutting the border to South Australia but telling people to delay travel to Adelaide. Perhaps from those health officers' meetings they had a hint of what was to come in terms of the shutdown. How sustainable is this approach over the next few years, or will we risk being cut off from each other as a country all the time? I've spoken to George Williams, the former Dean of the School of Law at UNSW and a Professor of Constitutional Law, about what options are available to the federal government in relation to this matter. He makes it clear that despite the recent High Court judgment against Clive Palmer, the federal government could legislate to allow it to take over control of state borders. He also argues that the feds could use the Biosecurity Act to take control and disputes claims by Attorney General Christian Porter that he was wrong in August concerning the Biosecurity Act being able to be used to open state borders. Christian Porter's office does not dispute what Williams is saying here about the ability to legislate. They point to the fact the approach by the federal government is to work bilaterally with the states, as agreed in National Cabinet, to attempt to set a hotspot definition to deal with state borders. Well, we know that definition is not being adhered to. In fact, that 10 days, average over 3 days, rolling 3 days, South Australia hasn't even qualified for that yet, and they're locking down. Anyway, the way things are going, Williams says here that there could be a realignment of power in this country, which puts states very much in the box seat. I think we've seen that again today. Have a listen to this interview. George Williams, thanks for joining us. Let's say you're the Prime Minister and you want to keep the state borders open, except in the case of a severe outbreak. What are your options?
Well, the Commonwealth was already prepared for this eventuality, and this is because the Biosecurity Act was passed in 2015. It's a massive 700-page piece of legislation which gives the Commonwealth quite extraordinary power to control the nation in the event of an outbreak. What the Commonwealth can do, for example, is set up human health response zones. They can control who enters parts of Australia, who stays in parts of Australia. And if they want to impose those, they can do so over what the states have already done. In effect, they can override the states and impose a national system for control that would supersede these border closures.
How practical is that, though? I mean, the states have police, the feds have the army. Do you think that's a practical thing they can do, or it's a technical thing they could do?
It's certainly they've got the power to do it, but you're right. I mean, there's questions about whether it's wise to do it. And that's because it doesn't always work well in the midst of a pandemic to have a fight between the Commonwealth and the states. And the last thing we need is the Commonwealth and the states at each other's throats over where people can move, and the political damage on both sides could be enormous if that happens, let alone the confusion in the community. And the other problem is, yes, to actually enforce this, maybe the Commonwealth's got the power, but does it have the personnel? I mean, the states do control the health officials, they control the police. So even though the Commonwealth has the upper hand legally if it wants to exercise it, it's not likely to be a wise thing to do. It can use it to pressure the states, but ultimately we need cooperation. We need the people to come together, or we could end up with a mess.
Well, some might argue we've already ended up with a mess, George Williams, but I noticed you wrote about this Biosecurity Act and the borders in the Australian in August, and I reported it at the time. The Attorney General Christian Porter at the time got up in the Coalition Party room and he said you were a former Labor Party candidate, so he attacked you personally, and that you were wrong. That's what he said. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I was 10 years ago. In fact, I wasn't even a candidate 10 years ago, but I was involved 10 years ago. And on this occasion, I'm actually suggesting how the Commonwealth can use its powers to override the Labor states. So I'm not sure the Labor states would actually want this, but it is something that's at the disposal of the Commonwealth if they want to use it. This is actually not a tricky legal point. In the Biosecurity Act, as I've said, is very clear about these matters. And even beyond the zones I've talked about, Greg Hunter's health minister has the power, once an emergency is declared, to make any direction, any determination that the Act itself can override any other law, including state laws. And even if they thought that wasn't enough, we're party to many conventions, some of which include things like freedom of movement. We could pass a separate law through the federal parliament to provide for freedom of movement. And lest there's any doubt as to who wins between the Commonwealth and the states, Section 109 of the Constitution says if there's a conflict, the Commonwealth wins and the state measure becomes inoperative, invalid. So legally, this isn't a tricky issue. The question is politics. Is there the will? Is there the desire? And is it sensible? Which, as I've said, may not even be made out.
Well, I'm intrigued by what you say there about passing legislation. So effectively, the Commonwealth could pass legislation to end Mark McGowan's hard border. Is that correct?
Yes, that is right. And it's possible they could even not pass legislation. They could just use the Biosecurity Act to do it. But as I've said, the power doesn't necessarily mean it's wise or that the Commonwealth wants the stand-up fight that it could have with the states. So there's a lot of politics, a lot of issues around operational methods involved in this. That means that, yes, they have the power, but there are other questions that need to come to the fore.
Well, let me ask about the Clive Palmer High Court case. There was a view around the place that this would settle things. Did the federal government pulling out of that case lead to an adverse result in terms of borders opening, or would it have had any effect? And also, why do you think the High Court found in the way it did?
And as to why the High Court has found, we're still guessing, because all we have are orders. We know the result, but we don't have the reasons. And those reasons might show, as is quite likely, that we're in the midst of a pandemic, and it's understandable that exceptions are made to the normal rule for free movement. And there's strong evidence that's already been collected that shows that this has been effective in protecting the West Australian community. So it may just be a straight down the line decision by the High Court. The Commonwealth pulling out wouldn't have helped Clive Palmer, but on the other hand, it's just not clear it made any difference either. As I've said, there's a clear path for the High Court to get to this result.